Hi, I'm Steve Cody, and welcome back to another edition of RepTV. As always, I'm joined by my lovely and talented co-host, Paul Marchand, who is raising his hand as we speak, and our special guest today, David Redlosk, who is a professor of political science at Rutgers University. Thank you for being here.
You bet.
And the topic of the day, the presidential campaign. And we're really hoping to get some insight from you into the morass that we find ourselves in. So, if anything, this election season has been marked by more negative rhetoric than I think any of us can remember in our lifetimes. Why has it built to this point?
Well, let me start. I don't think it's necessarily more, well, maybe than we can remember in our lifetimes, but negative campaigning has a long and honored history.
It's not wise to correct me.
Politics. It goes back to the beginning. Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams in 1800. The Adams people said if Jefferson was elected, there would be blood on the streets, the cries of the distressed, incest would be practiced openly. So we have a great history of negativity. Now, is it particularly bad this year? It might be. And if it is, it's mostly driven by the basic factor that politics is win or lose. It's a zero-sum game in American politics. If you don't win, you lose, so you do what it takes to win.
So sans colonial America, this is probably the worst that we've seen it in recent years.
Maybe.
Okay.
Maybe.
Okay.
It's been pretty bad for a while now.
Now, what do you think that does to the reputation of the political parties, both Republican and Democratic?
You know, I've done some research on negativity, and I'll start by saying that I actually am a fan of negative campaigning, because I think negative campaigning puts information into the environment that wouldn't be there otherwise. So voters can be better informed with negativity, but it has to be negativity that carries information, right? Pure mudslinging, insults, attacks, that's not especially useful. But negativity that tells people what the other person did and does so truthfully is useful information.
But to be fair, we've seen both in this election.
Oh yeah,
correct?
Absolutely. And we see both in every election. The term is mudslinging. Mudslinging happens all the time. There's great political science evidence that shows mudslinging does in fact depress turnout. It makes people more cynical. It gets them very frustrated with the system. But what I would call legitimate negativity, right? Negativity that provides real information actually can get people excited, can get people out, and actually increase turnout rather than decrease.
Interesting. So we didn't want to name any names, but Donald Trump,
other than him,
he's had a lot of success based on this strategy. But is that success really because what we're seeing? It looks like he's tapping into this segment of the distressed white segment of the population, really conservative, right-wing, feeling that their rights and privileges are being sort of trampled upon by minorities. Is that the reason why he's having success, or is there other underlying causes?
No, I mean, I think he absolutely tapped into a certain psyche that's out there in this election context. And that psyche really does have a lot to do with the fact that America has changed and continues to change and will continue to change. And people like me who were born into a certain amount of privilege, I grew up kind of a middle class, white guy, we thought we'd rule the world forever. And in fact, lots of different people rule the world now, right? And I think there is a certain frustration. But that's a little too glib. There's also an economic dislocation that's happening, and there are people out there for whom that the economic environment is not working, and Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders to some degree on the left have tapped into that very, very effectively.
Absolutely.
Can I just, real quickly, what about some of what I would see as the irresponsible comments that Trump has been making, and the alienating comments in terms of minorities, in terms of arming Japan and South Korea with nuclear weapons, doing whatever it takes to take out ISIS if it means killing innocent men, women, children?
Yeah, so I think what he's doing is still running his primary campaign. That worked because it tapped into a corner of the Republican Party. Remember that until his opponents dropped out, Trump never came close really to a majority. He was winning about 37% of the vote. and getting 48% of the delegates. So this was always a corner of one party.
Yeah.
He's continuing along that line, and what we're seeing is the rebound. His negatives have really driven up. 70% of American adults in a recent survey say they feel unfavorable about Donald Trump, and I think it's absolutely directly related to that frankly hateful rhetoric that he's been using.
Right, so now he's pretty much wrapped up the Republican nomination. He's turning his attention towards Hillary. He's turning his attention toward President Obama. He's attacked President Obama a lot. We haven't seen, at least not to our knowledge, a lot of defense from the side of President Obama on how Trump has been attacking his record. Why is that?
Part of it is that while the Democratic primary was playing out, I think the president did not necessarily want to insert himself directly. But I think we will see it. I actually think we will see a pretty full-throated defense of the president, both by him and by others, and of what he's accomplished. But he's had to tread this a little carefully, because what Sanders was tapping into is a wing of the Democratic Party that actually doesn't feel the president did all those things he promised, all that hope and change that he said we would get.
Yeah, and he got a lot of success with that as well, Bernie did for quite a while.
He did.
I want to do switch gears and talk about Hillary. Her unfavorables are off the charts as well, and a lot of people have said, her record notwithstanding, she's simply not a likable person. A, do you agree with that? B, if you were her counselor, what would you advise her to do to turn that around?
Hillary Clinton has such a lengthy history with American politics and has been attacked so directly and so hard for a quarter century or so. It's not terribly surprising her unfavorables are relatively high, although nowhere near where Donald Trump's are. What's more important actually for a general election is that different constituencies have different views, and there is a very large swath of American voters who actually feel very favorable about her, and they are really going to drive a lot of this election. But nonetheless, she's not the same kind of sort of warm fuzzy, let's say, that we got from, George W. Bush, right? Aw shucks, it's all good. And we can see where we went with that.
I think Dick Cheney was a little bit warmer.
Yeah, there you go. The likability thing, I think, is actually somewhat overrated. It's necessary in some sense, but ultimately, for the most part, most voters don't actually vote on that directly.
Interesting. Okay. Two things. This is the first of a two-part series that we're going to be conducting with the professor. So we're coming close to the end of the first part, but we have a live studio audience who are just dying to ask you all sorts of questions. So why don't we start with Deb Brown. Deb?
So you said earlier, which I thought was interesting, about that negative campaigns are good because it gets information out there. But what happens when Donald Trump is just saying blatant lies? And what are your thoughts on that? Because how do you get that information corrected besides maybe the news media correcting it?
It's actually really tough, right? When candidates outright lie, firstly, we don't really trust the news media particularly, right? And so for the news media to try to correct the lies is actually more difficult than you think it would be, which is one of the reasons that Kyle Maddy's my co-author and I on our book actually think negativity by candidates is important, because the other candidate, part of their job is to correct the record. It's to come out here and go after those kinds of lies. I think in Trump's case, we may see this brought to a level we've never seen before, right? And I think more recently, we're starting to see him called on it much more directly, not just by media, but even by some Republicans. And I think then it makes a difference.
Thank you.
Other questions? Please step up here.
Please write your question.
So I hate both Hillary and Donald Trump. I've seen that Bernie supporters are now turning to the Green Party nominee or candidate, Jill Stein. Would voting for her do anything? Does my vote count? I want to vote, but I refuse to vote for Hillary or Donald.
So as a practical matter, if you're a resident of New York State, go ahead and vote for Jill Stein, because Hillary Clinton is going to win New York State, no matter what Donald Trump has to say, and you won't create sort of a situation where by voting third party, Donald Trump wins. Right? I think one of the challenges in American politics is it is a two-party system. Yes, there's Jill Stein and the Greens. Yes, there are the Libertarians, there are others on the ballot, and I think you should vote who you believe and what you believe. But the reality is, if you're in a swing state and you vote for someone outside of the main parties, you're going to advantage a candidate that you may like even less than the one you don't like.
Yeah, but in New York, there's really no difference.
In New York, it's there. I will be bold. I don't think there's a world in which Donald Trump wins New York.
Wow, predictions like that.
Even with voting for Green Party or Libertarian.
When's the last time a Republican won New York? Do we know?
It's been a while.
A long
I don't
time,
have it off
yeah.
the top of my head, but it's been a while. Yeah.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, please. Hi.
Hi. So with recent terror in Orlando, there's been extreme criticism from audiences on how Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Hillary Clinton have approached the situation and how they've spoken about it. How would you recommend to speak about, to speak correctly, politically correctly?
Well, I mean, this is the challenge anytime you have horrific events like that, and how do our leaders bring us together to deal with them? The challenge on this is it's wrapping together so many different strands, right? The question about terrorism, but also the issue of the ease of access to guns. These cut in very different directions politically. So I think most people who support Hillary Clinton and support Barack Obama think they've handled it well, and particularly the president, that the empathy that he has really has been shown,
love.
right? I think those who support Donald Trump think he's handled it well by saying, well, we need to keep the Muslims out, and so on and so forth. The trick is, what do people in the middle think when it comes down to the actual elections? And at this stage of the game, I think where the president went is probably, where our leaders ought to go, rather than necessarily the efforts to politicize this on either side. But let's remember, politics matters, and the decisions that will get made politically will have a lot to do with, to what degree these kinds of things continue to happen.
Thank you.
Okay,
All right.
Thank you, studio audience, and hold your questions for part 2, because we are going to wrap up this segment. Thanks, Paul, for being here, and you're not going anywhere because we're about... David, I'm sorry, I don't know where Paul came from. David.
Well, you can thank me for being here too.
Paul, David.
That's what I thought you were doing.
Thank you, Steve, for being
I
here.
never thank Paul for anything. Thank you, David. And we will. This is the end of segment number 1, but stay tuned for segment number 2.